Hi, everybody. Welcome to this program here at the Learning Center of Senior Citizens Incorporated. It's great to have all of you who've joined us tonight in person at our Center for Successful Aging, but also an equally warm welcome to those who are taking advantage of the virtual option of tonight's program and who will be viewing the presentation in another day or so after it is recorded, edited, and ready for shipping. What a fantastic opportunity to recognize the achievement of someone who is really, I hope you don't mind our claiming you, Mark, one of the Learning Center's own. Mark Thomas has such a great leadership impulse here at the Learning Center with book clubs and with our reading forum on Friday afternoons. And to have discovered that he made something positive out of the pandemic, which was to gather his own poetry and create even more. What a treat. And I'm so delighted that he chose the Learning Center as a place to share that work tonight. I'm going to introduce now my friend and colleague Lee Rich, who works elbow to elbow with Mark in so many ways on the Friday Reading Forum as well as with the presentation of this book through her own publishing company. And I'm delighted always to have Lee at the helm here and to share the microphone with her. So Lee, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Roger. Thank you all for being here tonight. It is my great honor and great pleasure to get to know Mark, to get to work with Mark, and to introduce him tonight. Now, when the word learned comes to mind, so does Mark Thomas. Really, I think it is a word that describes him very succinctly. Not only does he have multiple graduate degrees, a very long, successful career as a federal professional, as well as archivist and college librarian. I also don't think he's ever met a book that he didn't appreciate. I was going to say that he didn't like, but I think appreciate might be the better word. If you've ever been in his house, there are bookshelves everywhere. And one of the things about Mark is that it's not just the breadth of his reading, but also the depth of his reading and his knowledge. I don't know anyone else who can talk on so many different topics and so passionately about so many different topics, as well as drill down into, he's more than a jack of all trades. He's an expert in a lot of these as well, and also just an amazing gentleman, and maybe a gentleman poet. So I'm going to hand it over to Mark. He can tell you a little bit more about his story and this first collection of poetry, and he already has additional collections, I think, ready to go. So thank you all, and Mark, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Roger. First, I want to thank my wife for putting together the fantastic spread out there. She has fun, and she says, no, she does not do catering anymore. So, second thing I want to get out of the way is probably most of you never saw me anything but T-shirts, sweatshirts, sweatpants. But this is a special occasion, and I suspected they might videotape it. So I went through my closet and I found some things. I had to dust my belt. But and there's Diane. Oh, great. But what can I say? Thank you all for coming. I'm glad to see you all. This is something new for me. I spent more than 40 years working in libraries, government offices, where careful, measured speech is the rule, not dramatic presentation. Here I am. I'm trying out another new thing, sort of like trying out publishing my poetry late in life. I'm only going to say a few words, then I'll read a few poems from my book, Surviving Fragments, and after that I'll take some questions. My parents introduced me to reading and poetry early. By the time I got to first grade, I knew how to read and drove teachers crazy because I was bored. My mother read us poetry, the stuff that she liked. My father read to us too. He particularly liked reading Kipling's Just So stories. And I still remember the way he liked to pronounce great, gray, green, greasy, Limpopo, and things like that. I've always read all sorts of stuff. Poetry was always part of it. From an early age, I have accumulated books, and some of them were poetry from an early time. I've written poetry off and on since high school, over more than 60 years. I've also moved many times from apartment to apartment, house to house, city to city. And as you know, when you move, things disappear. But I always had a box of my papers that somehow they did not all get lost or damaged or misplaced, that some survived. There were lots of bits and notebooks. I've still got a stack of notebooks I haven't finished going through. I keep finding new things I want to type up. A lot of old stenography pads that I probably purloined from the supply office at work. From time to time, I would add things from the box to the box, and from time to time, I'd go through it. I would type up some things. I went through a couple periods where I tried to submit things for publication. I used to have a collection of rejection notices, and I can't find that anymore. Not much loss. But during all this time, lots of the time I wasn't writing poetry, but my work always was with texts. Texts in, texts out, either as a student, a librarian, as a government worker, as an officer of a nonprofit. As a student, I was not fond of literature classes. A lot of literature was, for a time, ruined for me by assigned reading. However, in high school, I did have one teacher, Dorothy Martin, who got me involved in the student newspaper. And I did a lot of writing there. Yeah. I ended up being the editor of the paper, and I was one of the most reliable persons to churn out another couple column inches to fill out a page. And she encouraged me to write, and she did a good job of trying to minimize my purple prose. That was really all the writing teaching I ever had, was at the newspaper. But writing to task became my livelihood, task and deadline. And if you think that government correspondence, contracts, budgets, data analyses, meeting reports, regulations, procedure manuals, white papers, economic analyses, congressional testimony, contingency plans, and risk assessments are the graveyard of creativity and originality, then you have not been paying attention. There's a lot of creativity in those things. I wrote every day. I wrote to deadline. I was good at it. But as a side effect, I wrote less and less for pure fun. When I wrote poetry from time to time, it was mostly when I was underemployed. You know, sometimes when administrations changed and you'd been too identified with the past policy of the previous administration, you didn't have any work for a while. Then they decided they needed you again. Sometimes when I was between jobs, on vacation. For many years, I wrote very little poetry except in little windows of time. My wife, Margot, would occasionally prod me to pull my poems together and do something with them. She thought they were publishable. She had a nightmare about some children of ours coming and liquidating the estate and just throwing them all away. I procrastinated. Basically, I said, yeah, that's a good idea. But I never got around to it. But then during the pandemic, my younger son gave me a gift of a year's subscription to Storyworth. You may have heard their ads on NPR. I would get a weekly email message with a question and an assignment to write a brief essay answering that question. And at the end of the year, these would be compiled into a volume, and you could buy copies of the volume and give them to your family. And they were usually questions about your parents, your upbringing, your high school and college life, hobbies, things like that. Well, I discovered that you could go on their website and pick your questions, edit questions, add questions. So I had a good time playing games with their stuff. I ended up with, at the end of the year, my essays kept getting longer. by the end of the year, I had to put it in 2 volumes. They couldn't fit it all in one of their usual volumes. But I caught the writing bug again, and that got me going back to my box of poems. And, you know, at that point, I'd had some of them on a computer once before, but that computer died and I didn't have a good backup. So everything had to be typed again new. I started to rewrite some of them, and then I started to write some new poems, and then I started to see them as a book, and even developed a title in which I described their nature and origin, and a big enough compiled manuscript to consider publishing, and then I had a stroke of good fortune. Here at the Learning Center, I signed up for the Reading Forum when I began with the project of reading Tolstoy's War and Peace. And believe me, I've got a much longer list of books that I want to read than I've ever read. I'm very disappointed with the expected lifespan. One of the instructors was Lee Rich, and it turns out that among many other activities, she runs a small independent publishing company, Montechicheri Publishing. Did I say that right?
Yeah, as close as I think I can get.
Yeah. So in the course of events, I mentioned to her about my book of poetry. She agreed to take a look at it, and here we are. So getting the book ready for publication was not simple or easy or quick. I was asked earlier during the reception if Lee edited the book. Yes, she edited the book. And we had discussions about punctuation and repetition and things like that. And I took some of her suggestions and didn't take some of them, but it was all sorted out amicably. It was an interesting process. In my previous work, I'd been both edited and editor. I had prided myself on calm professionalism and no prickly pride of authorship. Anything I wrote for the government was always reviewed, revised, tweaked, criticized by myriad denizens of layers of bureaucracy. Most of them I never saw. Most of them didn't even know what they were reading. But editing my poetry felt different. Each question, each suggestion change, each comment and query did tug at my ego a little bit more than I expected it to. So I had to think, I had to stop and think, why was I doing it that way? What did I intend back when I first, well, some of the times I didn't even know when I wrote it. It took a while. In the end, I really think that the poems and book are better for those exchanges and iterations. I'm happy with it. So thank you, Lee, for helping with both editing and publishing the book. I also want to thank a couple of readers who over the years gave me good advice and comments on my poems. Tom Hoyer was my colleague in the federal government for years. And he and I would swap things that we both wrote off and on. He's retired to Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, where he is an officer of their Writers Guild, which is a big, complicated, impressive organization. I'm very impressed with it. We don't have anything comparable in Savannah. I'm jealous. But he'd read a lot of the poems, and I still had his comments from years ago. And my friend Carolyn Banks, who's involved in the Learning Center here and heads up the Italian conversation group, and knows some of the people here. And, her husband had been a fairly well-known poet in his time, and she gave me a good reading of it and very good comments. And I would be happy if she was here tonight, but she just got back from Sardinia and is a little tired. Most of all, I want to thank my wife, Margot. She consistently encouraged and prodded me to get this one done and to start my next book of poems. So yes, there will be more poems. I'm working on a few projects. I don't know yet if they are, well, let me say, it's taking shape. I've been reading a lot more poetry also, and that gives me new ideas and models. I'm going to poetry readings, even online when I can, and that sets some examples. I've joined a writing group. It's just a little one. But I'm the only poet in it, so I would hope to find a poetry writing group somewhere in Savannah, but there doesn't seem to be an active one that looking for people with my demographics. I do have at least 4 future projects. I've always written some haiku. Most of my stuff starts out pretty unstructured, but I like playing with haiku, which are very structured. And so I'm taking my new haiku and setting them apart. And at some point, I'm hoping to find somebody to illustrate that, make that a separate book. I have more fragments from my box of old poems, and they'll be collected together in a book to be titled Reconstructed Fragments, because these are things that need more work. They really need to be rebuilt. There is a first draft of a book of new poems that I've shared with a few people. It's in several parts. One, I've been thinking about reading a lot about artificial intelligence and the questions it raises about consciousness and creativity. So I have a group of poems called Talking to the Machines. And then there are a group of poems based on my own experience with COVID. My wife and I both had it twice. And talks with others about the lasting effects of the pandemic. And, you know, a lot of my friends are my age cohort, and it hit us hard. I'm calling that Listening to the Survivors. And there are other poems that are accumulating that have various themes. The poems of the Listening to the Survivors thing, I almost think of as a choral work. So I want to recruit some people to do a recording of those series of poems with different voices, because I think it might make an effective short performance piece. And so I've got some stuff. I'm feeling energized. I'm having fun. That was longer than I thought it would be. I did an interview on WRUU a couple days ago with P.T. Bridgeport, who's sitting in the back taking pictures. I had a good time with him. And that affected some of what I'm going to choose to read tonight. One poem, I'm going to start with the poem I wrote to be a prefatory note to Surviving Fragments. You have to forgive me because I can't memorize poetry, so I'm going to have to read from it and try to project as best I can while looking down. And thank God for, oh no, not again. I had this problem at the studio too. With the earphones, I had to take the earphones off because I got my glasses tangled in them. Prefatory note. Herein, with little craft or discipline, is an assortment, from juvenilia to elder crankiness, with occasional epiphanies. No writing class, no workshop, no writers group projects. Here are bits and pieces accumulated, moved from place to place, some bits almost 30 times, but not revised for consistency, and finally typed, cleaned up, reformatted, revisited, and re-edited, and presented for your entertainment. Be thankful that you remain ignorant of the remnants now discarded as childish, foolish, confused, or merely repulsive. Having failed to track when and where the pieces were written originally, or derivatively as it were, and having long served as a librarian, the surviving fragments are here presented in alphabetical order. That was stimulated by my experience of trying to put the book together. I tried to arrange it by themes. I tried to figure out the chronology. I couldn't even figure out the chronology. I have no idea when some of these things were written. A few, I have very clear memories. I remember when and where and what's prompted them, but that's very few. And I'm afraid I'm never going to be able to say that again, since now I'm doing writing groups and I'm trying to get going to writing seminars and things like that. So I'll never again be able to claim innocence. There's some longer poems in here, but I find them very hard to read because my voice gives out. So I just picked a couple. I mentioned my friend Tom Hoyer, who was one of the people who read a lot of the poems. And there's one poem in here that's specifically a letter for Tom. And by the way, Tom does have a copy of this, and he and I have been going back and forth by email about his thoughts on it, and he's still sending me some of the things that he writes, which are mostly nonfiction. But letter replying to a friend. It has been a long time, so it will be again. Although we all have suffered, some of us have grown. We remain much the same. I keep many hopes which you cannot fulfill. We are again beginning anew. Although we are all damaged, no one here is broken or dead. Remember, we have been known to laugh. We steer well clear of boys that mark despair and defeat, except when we are left adrift. Do you fare any better? Have you ever been entered by ecstasy? One that I read on the radio, but I still like it, and I think it's a comment on one of the things I particularly care about. And it'll lead right into the last poem I'm going to read. It's called Perhaps Not a Poem. Perhaps I'm not a poet. I love the word, the feel of play and power, and yet I doubt. 'Tis such a solemn role to wrap around yourself. The mystery and sensitivity, the sublimity of passion might overwhelm me. Could I endure to stand so strong encased in pride and make a monument of myself? Life is hard enough to understand without making a secret of it, known only to the perfect souls of the chosen few. So I'll just play with words. No awesome names for me. I'll do my best to share confusion as well as hopes, fear along with beauty, for those are what I have. If I can take a fragment of my day and have another live it over with me, then that is enough. It need not be a poem. Like I said, I read a lot of poetry. I've read some poetry criticism the last few years. Some people are just so special about it, it annoys me. But that's okay. Most of the time when you're writing poetry, it's because you need to. Lee mentioned my books. We have a rule, book in, book out. We've modified that rule, so now books can be stacked on top of the shelf, or some shelves are 2 layers deep, but all books have to be on a bookshelf. I'm not allowed to have them stacks on the floor or in the garage or in the attic. I have trouble getting books out, but we've taken up the habit of filling little free libraries. So we have a good way of making a moral enterprise out of our excess. And then all the things, Lee and P.T. Bridgeport there and I are going to be out at the Village Library book sale on Skidaway Island this Saturday. And at the end of that book sale, I've got an arrangement we've done a couple times with the leftover books. Book lady bookstore picks through some and takes some, and I take the rest and put them in little free libraries. So, but anyhow, there's a poem in here called Books that I wanted to read particularly. And I'll tie in the end back to what I just read about, Perhaps Not a Poem. Lives on my shelves, stacked away days, gravel raked, rocks all in place, flowers gathered in bright bunches, something to suit every motion of my friendly face or to creep into the crevices of my secret selves. Counters in my many games, picked pieces placed up front to daunt the enemy, reserves held back for rescue or surprise, trumps played out with timely finesse. Never able to fix you in my selfish sky or name you into constellations still. You are more the measure of myself than astrology or the painted cards. No height or place limits you or me. You settle always in delightful pattern. New light and color reveal you by both chance and manipulation, an ever-changing kaleidoscope of new combinations and relations. Oh, you grow, you pile up, you spread out and up, large and heavy in all my house and life. Yet I welcome you, and I'm not overwhelmed, but for a moment, though at times tired, wading slow-legged through your swamps, climbing too high with unneeded baggage. Still, when all complaint and guilt are put aside and honesty prevails, I must say of you in my books, you've opened me as I have opened you. Now, what I wanted to say, referring back to perhaps not a poem, the other day I had my day made wonderfully. Wilma came up to me in the hall here and said, quoted to me the last 2 lines of that poem on books. And what more could I ask? Yeah. So that's all I'm going to read. So, any questions? Any comments or requests?
Are you still writing poetry?
Yes. Yes, I'm still writing poetry. I have a whole manuscript of new poetry.
When you commented about they think so much of themselves, I just kind of wonder, are you talking about poets or people talking about poets?
Can you repeat the question?
I didn't hear the question.
Okay. When you were talking about having read both poetry and poetry reviewers and critical information, I just wondered when you said that they think so much of themselves that whether you were talking about the poets or the reviewers.
Oh, both, This is a common problem, I think, in all creative and intellectual fields. People want to feel special. They are special. Making things is special. But it's also a widely spread ability. And lots and lots of people should be encouraged to try it more, wherever they are in their lives. And there's sort of a romantic mythology of the inspired poetic genius or whatever that takes on this dramatic posturings and stuff. I'm a little impatient with it. And some of the critics encourage it because then they are included in this holy few of themselves, able to have their own special appreciations that are not accessible to the many. Well, if the many can't read it, I'm not sure what it's worth. Wayne?
Your comment that getting... Oh, give me 1 second. Thank you. On your comment about feeling getting too old and all those books you haven't read, I wouldn't worry about that. I think that's a proof for immortality, because those books, you're going to read them somehow, somewhere.
Yeah.
Now, that's one of my proofs, because I have the same problem. I have,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they also are in the garage, everywhere, but
Well,
I'm going to get to them one day.
Yeah. One of my articles of hopeful faith is that if there is an afterlife, Jorge Luis Borges is in charge of it.
The book club. He's ahead of the book club up there, yeah.
What draws you to haiku as a form?
Oh, what brought me to haiku as a form? Well, I belong to an odd college fraternity, which conducted some of its meetings in German, and the fraternity song was the Ode to Joy, sung in German. And I could still remember most of that, even though I can't usually remember poetry except for Jabberwocky. And there was a little group in that early 60s fraternity that was busily reading Zen and Alan Watts and things like that, and fascinated by all things Japanese. And I took up with them and got reading what they were reading. So I read all sorts of odd things. So when you're reading, some haiku come out of the Zen discipline, not all haiku. But that's where I got introduced. And that's where I started trying to write some. Now, just recently, I found a variant that I'm going to try. Richard Wilbur, who I'd read bits of in anthologies over time, but I recently picked it up as collected poems in a used bookstore and started to read him more systematically. He has a whole bunch of haiku in which the first and third lines rhyme. And I hadn't seen that structure before. I thought that was interesting.
I was wondering about rhyme. How important is it to you?
I like rhyme. I like alliteration. I like internal rhymes in lines more than I like rhyming lines. But I'm trying to learn things and study. I'm having fun. So now that I'm a poet, I had to build a library not only of poetry, but do a thing I never did before and collect some books on poetics. So I'm learning all sorts of stuff I never paid attention to in my life. I still can't tell you what some of the things are, but I can tell you that with the exception of Claude 3, the artificial intelligence things that claim to be able to write poetry cannot tell the difference between a Shakespearean and a Petrarchan sonnet. So, and rhyme poorly. I like playing with AI too.
What makes you want to start a poem? Is it a line you hear, a word you hear, or an image that comes into your mind? Or is it always the same or different? Can you give us some idea of how
Yeah.
you start?
Okay, you gave me a lead line. In my new book, there's a poem called How I Write. So I'm going to read that to you. And that, P.T. Bridgeport back here knows this, because we talked about it the other day. How I Write, or Interrogating the Poet. Going to readings, listening to interviews, the same questions. Again, again, again. How do you get ideas? How do you write? When? Where? Writer's block. Rewrite. Revise. I imagine my own responses. What will I say? Fantasy? Nightmare? If I am ever in that chair, at that microphone, with those questions, again, again, again. Ideas visit me at 3 o'clock in the morning. Riding in the car, watching birds in the yard, and sometimes I remember them. My handwriting is not writing, it is indecipherable. So I type, always at the computer, in a room filled with pictures and dictionaries. I always start with the lines centered because I love to watch shapes emerge from uneven lines of text. I write when I write, sporadically, impulsive, without discipline, usually early in the morning, but often is the key. Writer's block is not my burden, rather ease, glibness, too fast to flow, too many words. Revision comes with time, waiting, rereading. Is mostly deletion and listening, using the tuning fork of the rhythmic tongue to tune the fork in the words. And yet the trouble is finishing, to say it is done, to say no more revisions, review, revisiting, doubting. So in the end, to make an end, to send it on, to submit to it, stop and read aloud. Listen and hear. Does the line fall or rise to the right note? So that answers a bunch of questions.
Mark, following up on that last line, I see rhyme in your poetry occasionally, but I always see a rhythm.
Yes.
And it's not always the same rhythm. It varies from poem to poem. Is that something you consciously do?
Sometimes it just comes out that way. It's something I always notice when I'm rereading and revising and rewriting. And then sometimes I tweak it and add things to improve it, or take things out to improve it. But it always ends up, it has to feel right when I read it aloud.
First one and the other.
I really am perplexed by Alley of Garbage. I absolutely loved the poem, and then I was stopped dead in the midst of it and questioning and left unsettled. But also I was very aware of your changing cadence and the italics too. So if you would give a little history of that poem, that would be great.
History. It's set in Baltimore in the 1970s. Yeah. Hey, Baltimore has wonderful alleys. We used to live in a heavy student neighborhood near Johns Hopkins. The end of every school year was particularly good pickings in the alleys. All those rich students would throw away amazing stuff. So yeah, we were dumpster divers, alley walkers, pickers, and so most of it is just reminiscing about that. But then, you know, when you're walking through alleys, weird shit happens. And so some of it turns into a question of, did that really happen? Was it a fantasy? Was it a mannequin? I don't know. I found that in my box, and I wasn't sure what I meant. But I left it in. Because it felt right. And being uneasy is okay. Poetry is okay to make you uneasy. It's okay for some of it to make you sad or angry too. It's not all flowers and unicorns.
From a fellow dumpster diver, I appreciate that. So Surviving Fragments being your freshman endeavor, and they always say about a freshman album, book, that you've had your whole life to create that work, you know, ups, downs, all kinds of the things that happen in life. So now working on your sophomore project, where is it kind of like from current, where you're at currently, and then going into the book, or are you trying to go back into previous moments of your life?
Yeah, I think you missed part of, I don't know. I've got at least 2, maybe 3 books in progress. One manuscript that I think it feels finished to me, but that I just wrote something today that I want to add into it. So it's obviously not finished. So what can I say about that? But that's all new poetry that I've written in the last year and a half. I've got a stack of things. One of them, a small part of it sitting next to the computer of the old poetry. I've promised Margot that I'm going to dig out more of the old poetry and get more of that in another book. And that's going to be called Reconstructed Fragments. And I cannot give you a date because, like I said, my handwriting is indecipherable. So it's taking me a good bit of work. But I found one piece in there that I'd been looking for years, and I just found it last week. I remembered writing it, and I'd wanted to include it in Surviving Fragments, and I couldn't find it then, but it just popped up. So what can I say? And then I've got more haiku that I'm putting aside and dealing separately. And there will be more new poetry, and that'll either go into the current manuscript of new poetry or some other future. I don't know.
Anybody else like to ask a question? Make a comment? Anything at all? Yes, sir.
I was intrigued by your introduction to poetry by your parents when you're very young. I have a friend who's homeschooled all of their children and did the same thing. It's amazing what young people can absorb and remember. In fact, introduced some of the children to T.S. Eliot when they were very young. I think the second oldest daughter is now 50 and can recite some of T.S. Eliot's most difficult poems from memory.
Yeah.
And so I would encourage people who think that children cannot handle poetry in any way, whether it's children's poetry or adult poetry. No, they have a natural, I think they have a natural affinity for poetry. It must be something in the species.
Yeah. You know, I hang out in bookstores, particularly used bookstores. So some of my friends have used bookstores. So one of them out in Richmond Hill, there's a place called Bookstore on the Hill, hidden in a shopping center back behind Ace Hardware. It's hard to find. But it's the cheapest used bookstore in the area. I had a book sale and signing out there a few weeks ago. And I had a wonderful time talking to a couple kids that were homeschooled there. And one of them, their mother, was buying a book of poetry and she was going to read it to them. And I thought, well, okay. I'm not sure all of this is appropriate for children, but it should be interesting. Some of it's fine. I made sure that all my grandkids became acquainted with Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats at a young age. You know, my mother was an interesting person because she would read us Longfellow and stuff like that, but also Don Marquis' Archie and Mehitable, or sometimes some other people like Dorothy Parker that she particularly liked. So she had a snarky sense of humor too.
There's not a man, woman, or child that doesn't like the occasional Dorothy Parker poem.
I may be reading too much into the things that you've written, but one of the threads I felt, and this may just be me, but tell me, running through your work was a note of skepticism on human pretension. And I'm exemplify with we talked a little earlier about fancy apes, or the insufficiency of language, or the one on reason. And I just wonder, and those are just a few of them, whether you see that as well.
Oh, sure. Yeah, in college, I changed my major almost every semester, but a couple times it was philosophy. I had a shattering semester early in my career of reading David Hume and A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic. It had me wondering whether I could even say anything at all. Yeah, I've always been skeptical. In high school, I sort of liked being willing to debate anything and liked having a nickname of Doubting Thomas. But later on, I got more generous. And yeah, I'm skeptical, but I'm still fond of people.
Healthy skepticism.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Like, Lee, you want to add something?
I'll just add on to that because it's interesting that I find the same thing in reading Mark's collection and Mark's poetry. And also every single time with your title, that's how I read the title in my first gut reaction, as opposed to the actual, reality of these are your surviving fragments from the years that have moved with you 30 times. For me, it's that surviving sort of the fragmentariness of life, and yet still kind of being skeptical, but intrigued and mystical and engaged at the end of it all.
And so what's remarkable is that work that was done over such a long period of time, you are in it so much, really.
Well, thank you.
And I appreciate that deeply. Yeah.
Thank you. I like that.
Any other questions or comments from the room? I feel the need to address something if we're indeed closing up before we have the opportunity to acquire a copy of Mark's book, if we don't have one already. This notion of books in, books out, the volume of volumes that we own and so on. One of my very best friends, 25 years on, is a bibliophile of the highest order. And he gave a talk actually a number of years ago here at the Learning Center about his life of reading. He has a life plan for reading, a really impressive library. And those very few people whom he allows to come in and look at the room, he said he ended his talk with the questions I hate to get. And one of them was, have you read all of these books in your library? And he decided that his answer was going to be henceforth, no. Have you eaten all the food in your refrigerator yet? So there's some interesting applications, aren't there? So I'm going to encourage all of you to acquire a book, whether you have room for one or you don't.
And there's actually a Japanese word for that. I can't remember it.
You can just make something up.
Yeah, for collecting the books that you hope to read. It's your aspirational shelf.
That's right. It's aspirational. That's right. Well, Mark, thank you so much for leading such a wonderful hour. The Learning Center is a lot of things, but tonight it becomes so clear to me that it's a community above all else. And thank you all so much for being part of this really wonderful hour, and thank you for leading us.
Well, thank you.